Thank you. Good morning to you all, and thanks to Professor Wimbush for inviting me to respond to his lecture. I'm a professor of U.S. Cultural History, African American Studies, and Gender Studies at the University of Versailles-Saint-Quentin in France near Paris, where I was hired in September 2019 after teaching African American Studies for 18 years at the University of Tours in the Loire Valley. I've specialized in African American Studies since the 1990s, completing my PhD under the supervision of Professor Geneviève Fabre in 1998. The book that came out of my doctoral research on the poetics of call and response in African American folk sermons was published in French in 2000, but with one chapter appearing in English in Vincent Wimbush's African Americans in the Bible. That's when our friendship started. Since then, my work has borne on race and gender relations in the US from the 19th century to the present, particularly in the Deep South, thanks to a leave without pay that I took to teach African American Studies at the University of Alabama in 2009-2010. My comparative sociological study of Black-white interracial couples in the American South and France, which is the result of 10 years of fieldwork, was published by Routledge in 2020. I'm really honored today to be part of the panel and to follow the speakers who offered their reflections yesterday. So my talk this morning will be entitled Between the Veil and the Mirror, the Scripturalization of Black Modernity in France. Race is a most unwelcome term in France these days. The first sentence of Article 1 of the Constitution of the French Republic, written in 1958, no longer reads, quote, France shall be an indivisible, secular, democratic, and social republic. It shall ensure the equality of all citizens before the law, without distinction of origin, race, or religion, end of quote. In July 2018, the word race was struck out of the current French Constitution by a unanimous vote of our equivalent of the US House of Representatives. This lawmaking body, which was renewed in 2017 and is made up of 341 members of President Emmanuel Macron's newborn centrist party out of the 566 seats, boasts an unprecedented percentage of almost 40% of women representatives, but very few non-white faces or foreign-sounding last names. The previous socialist president, François Hollande, whose presidency went between May 2012 and May 2017, had called for the revision of constitutional language in a campaign pledge that he had made in 2012 but never delivered. On the contrary, following terrorist attacks in Paris, Hollande's government considered stripping of their French citizenship any so-called homegrown terrorists, presumably non-white, in addition to the extant legal sanctions, a move that an overwhelming majority of legal scholars and his own Minister of Justice, a Black woman who was an elected official from French Guiana, deemed unnecessary and divisive. Significantly, the last time French citizenship had been revoked by a French government, it was during Nazi occupation and targeted French Jews. Today, the country's constitution only guarantees equality, quote, without distinction of origin, sex, or religion, which in effect, erasing race, leaves any French citizen unprotected from race-based discrimination, and of course precludes any possibility of systemic racism on the part of the French state itself. However, the passing of the revision received next to no media coverage and was met with remarkable indifference in the midst of the fever around, slide please, the Football World Cup, which was eventually won by a French national team. Could you please show the slide, Jamie? A French national team of mostly African Francophone descent. The players themselves objected to being seen as anything other than French, seeking to deflate controversy in social media, notably between the Daily Show host Trevor Noah and the French ambassador to the US over the unaddressed legacy of French imperialism and the silencing of daily discriminations suffered by Black French citizens, including high-profile athletes, whenever they are defeated or found guilty of minor offenses. As the Canadian sociologist Daniel Juteau explains, the stubborn refusal, you were just speaking of denial and refusal, so we're right here, Shay. The stubborn refusal of France's white elites to consider and even scientifically discuss the real implications of race and ethnicity as social constructs has strong political underpinnings. From the perspective of sociologists who are overwhelmingly of French or otherwise European descent, slide please, Jamie. This is a pretty long quote, so I'm hoping that it will show easily enough for me to save some time. That racial categories were originally constructed as part and parcel of a system of appropriation, that they served to justify slavery and other forms of domination and to reproduce inequalities through monopolistic closure, justifies the rejection of racial and also ethnic categories, since the latter are equated with the former. Furthermore, recognizing how racism naturalizes and excludes human beings and groups comforts the Republican ideal of equality for all through same treatment and the non-recognition of quote-unquote difference. But as the confusion concerning racial and ethnic dynamics persists, the specific processes underlying ethnic trajectories, positions, and identities keep on being misunderstood. The idea of Republican integration plays in French sociology a role similar to the dictatorship of the proletariat in orthodox Marxist sociology, transforming itself into a methodological nationalism which forbids the analysis of ethnic dynamics. End of quote. This refusal to discuss the very concepts of race and racialization in the name of the universalist values of the Enlightenment finds its justification in the fear of mutual distrust that presumably inevitably flows from racial identity politics, as if political radicalization and parochialism were inevitable when you discuss race and when you hear Black people voicing their experiences. Since the Black Lives Matter movement gained global exposure, particularly after the murder of George Floyd in June 2019, triggered a wave of protests and toppling of statues symbolizing European nations' slaveholding heritage, French scholars and activists using and teaching the tools of critical race theory and intersectionality have been increasingly anathematized by politicians, conservatives like the current Minister of Education, but also a number of socialists, all of them accusing them of quote unquote Americanizing the minds of young Black French men and women who until then had presumably been content with their lot. This polarization has led here in France, as in the US, to calls to silence as dangerous radicals all those who challenge their invisibility as Black French persons or draw attention to the existence of a white norm or white frame underpinning the French definition of citizenship. Mimicking the US culture wars, French public opinion is now invited to see in the defense of racial, ethnic, and sexual minorities a fascist crusade against straight white males, with some media commentators explicitly accusing those French intellectuals embracing CRT of being complicit with Islamic fundamentalists. Yet French-born theorists of race did articulate the scripturalization of Black bodies as colonial bodies without necessarily having been influenced by an exposure to US theories of race. Slide, please, Jamie. I knew that many people would discuss Fanon, so I wanted to introduce someone maybe lesser known and who stood right in between the Black and white status of colonized subjects, being a Jewish born in Tunisia, a Jewish French born in Tunisia. As early as in 1957, the philosopher Albert Memmi, born in Tunisia and therefore not a French citizen but an indigenous colonial subject, shed light on the systematically negative definitions of the colonized subject by the colonizer, offering a two-faced portrayal of the two sides of the colonial coin and prompting African American civil rights activists to marvel at the similarities with race relations between Blacks and whites in Jim Crow America. His book was not translated into English until 1965, 2 years before Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. Memmi, like Fanon, demonstrated the inherent link between the colonial situation and the necessity for any European newcomer to embrace whiteness and all its racist underpinnings in order to enjoy citizenship rights not only at the expense of the natives, but on the basis of their systemic exploitation and degradation. Sorry. He also emphasized the frustration of the members of the French colonizer caste when considering the relative lack of racism of metropolitan French visitors vis-a-vis the natives of North Africa. Colonizers' idealized vision of France clashed with the country's indifference to race matters as opposed to intra-racial, class, and regional issues. This indifference, of course, ceased when the colonizers were quote unquote repatriated to a country that they had never seen, and when Arab and sub-Saharan African colonial subjects in the following decade of the 1970s began migrating to France. African Americans are the desirable Black other. The French whites, Black men and women, who can be dealt with on an equal footing because of the complex fostered by the two liberations of the country by US troops. Black Americans are on the side of modernity and make France feel good about itself because their presence helps public opinion avoid any discussion of the slaveholding and colonial legacy of France, to focus instead on the purported success of the French assimilationist model. Here, there have been no lynchings of Blacks. The killings of peaceful Algerian demonstrators who were beaten to death and or thrown into the River Seine in 1961 are scripturalized as signs of the importation of a colonial conflict into the hallowed metropolitan soil, not as symptoms of systemic racism. And now I'd like to move on to the next slide to show you the portrait of Josephine Baker in her uniform as a member of the French resistance to Nazism. This portrait will, at the end of this month, grace the Pantheon. Could you please show the next slide? A former church turned into a secular temple celebrating the ancestors of the Republic, whose remains are transferred into it in great pomp. She will be the sixth woman to be admitted there and the first woman of color, following only two French descendants of slaves, namely, slide please, the colonial governor Félix Éboué, thank you, who welcomed General de Gaulle in Chad when French resistance to Nazism desperately needed the support of the country's colonies. And next slide, please, the world-famous writer Alexandre Dumas. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot Dumas, or did he get skipped somehow? I'm sorry. Who authored the famous Three Musketeers, and of whom very few French people know that he was a descendant of slaves. As for Toussaint Louverture and Aimé Césaire, the last two Black men who were introduced into the Pantheon, they only have plaques. Their remains have remains in the Americas, which completely makes sense from a political standpoint. Since August 2021, Josephine Baker, who was born in 1906 in Missouri and died in 1975 in France, has been iconized as the most modern symbol of France. The official message issued by the presidency to explain this choice reads that Baker is, I quote, the embodiment of the French spirit because, I quote again, she fought all the good fights that gather citizens of goodwill in France and throughout the world, end of quote. Another quote that I'd like to share with you is again by President Macron, who said to justify the choice of the African American artist who made the radical choice of eternal and universal France, is that she proved to the world that, I quote, emancipation and liberty could be won by willpower. Every single choice that Josephine Baker made finds an echo in what we are living today. She is a mirror in which everyone may project themselves. The image of the mirror is a convenient avatar of the mask for a president who is like his predecessors, intent on indirectly celebrating his own idealized legacy by choosing a protective ancestor for the nation to worship, just 6 months before his own re-election bid. Where other prominent figures of Black men or women, such as the Martinique and Nardal sisters, whom you see on screen, could have been chosen to embody French-speaking culture and democratic spirit, Josephine Baker was a particularly fascinating, festive representation and celebration of Black flesh in her quasi-nudity, when she mingled the music hall codes with minstrel show codes, slide please, Jamie, to the Europeans to become a sex symbol in her famous Revue Nègre from 1925. Like so many before who had to grin, roll their eyes, and carouse to hide more subtle signifying behind their performances of the grotesque, Josephine Baker carved a place for herself in the hearts of French men in particular by comforting them in the belief that France was heaven to African Americans. Could you please show the next slide so that we can see the minstrel show codes that she introduced in what was known as the Jazz Age in France and was just the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance in the United States. Among the quotes by Josephine Baker, the pledge of patriotism that she made when choosing the side of French resistance to Nazi occupation is particularly effective in silencing any criticism today and scripturalizing French patriotism. I quote, "France has given me everything, use me as you will. I will save the country in my own way," by which she meant that she would use her own celebrity status to spy for the French resistance during the occupation of the country. In a move that is typical of the refusal to acknowledge the existence of systemic racism by propelling to the forefront the so-called token Negro, the injunction to be grateful to France is constantly thrust by politicians and media influencers in the faces of any high-profile Black French person of African descent, in particular, who dares suggest that the Republic's ideals of equality and fraternity have not yet materialized for non-American Blacks in France, or anyone who complains of the gratuitous administrative hoops through which immigrants must jump when applying for French nationality. Josephine Baker speaking before Martin Luther King on the march at the March on Washington, and her being the only woman who was allowed to take the microphone on that occasion, are also largely extolled in France to showcase her anti-racist credentials, especially as she appeared in her French military uniform on the occasion and praised France as, I quote, "a fairyland place." So to conclude, I find it particularly significant that the body of a Black American woman is being so astutely utilized like soft wax, as Dr. Wimbush would argue, in the long-standing rivalry between two nations whose claims to embody universal human aspirations to freedom have been similarly grounded in the erasure of their own Black citizens. As Vincent Wimbush said in stage 5 of the exhibition, quote, "to make Blackness a supercharged, hyper-signified reality, and in every respect, the lack and the limit." Thank you for your attention.